Hi, I'm Emily Simmons, the Director of Legal and Policy Services here at the School Boards Association, along with Harry Frank, our Director of Board Education. Hi, Harry.
Good evening, Emily. Thanks for having me join you this evening.
And here we are for Board Chair 101, how to be an effective leader of your school board. So here's our overview for the evening. These are the 4 essential roles that a school board chair carries out. And we're going to go through each of these in detail. School board chairs are responsible for promoting the development of a strong board team that understands its role and performs the board's essential work. The chair also is responsible for establishing a strong connection with the administration to build a common vision and a strong sense of teamwork with the administration. Third, the board chair will organize and conduct productive meetings. And finally, promote lawful and ethical operations at all times for the school board.
I wanted to add the observation here that I think there's a balance of what I would call mechanical skills, such as building an agenda and carrying it out, and maybe what we'd call soft skills, which really are about the relationships and interactions of members of the board and how central it is to the role of the chair that they develop and use both of those skills in both of those arenas.
Yeah, I think the really effective chair brings both of those sides together. You're exactly right, Harry. All right, let's go to the first key role of an effective board chair, which is to promote the development of a strong board team that understands its role and performs its essential work. So the first element of that is really to build a team. Boards are made up of just people who come from very different places and perhaps philosophies, and all board members have their own reasons for joining the board and why they chose to run or accept an appointment to the board. And the chair's task is really going to be to help maximize each person's strengths and skills and help them to work on any difficulties that they have as a school board member and really bring them together as a team. So that's going to involve these elements. Building relationships with each member of the board at the beginning, welcoming new board members and ensuring that they receive an orientation, ensuring that all board members understand they're an integral part of the board, staying aware of board dynamics as you go through your board cycle, establishing ground rules for board meetings and for decision making on the board, and where appropriate, creating committees to help the board perform its work outside of the regularly scheduled board meeting.
So I think you've hit a good balance again here, Emily, between sort of the relationship dimensions of this work and the structural dimensions of the work. So for instance, committees being a structural strategy for orchestrating effective work as a committee, as a board. I mean, it really comes back to this challenge of we all come to the table with our ideas and opinions, concerns and aspirations. And I think the chair is continually in that position of hearing those individual voices, but finding a way to blend them as a body. But that can be very challenging at times, particularly if people hold on to a single issue to drive their perspective on the board. And so there needs to be sort of a clear strategy that has both those elements, those, like I said, the relationship and the structural pieces at play.
And I think we should add that these same elements go for your for a local board team as well as a supervisory union board team, and those two levels could present different sets of challenges, but it's important to keep it in mind if you're the chair of a supervisory union board that you might have more upfront work to do, perhaps with people that are not from your local board, but you can use these same tools.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Often there's a bit of a distance for board members between their sort of connection to their school district and then connection to the broader supervisory union.
And our next two slides kind of speak to those differences. So the role of the local school board is to serve on behalf of the community to provide strong oversight of education, and that involves ensuring high quality education for all the students, as well as ensuring that the public gets a good return on its investment with its public education dollars, and all at the same time ensure that the system is operating effectively and ethically. Goes hand in hand with the role of the supervisory union board, which is to really oversee education for our region, promoting equal educational opportunity across the entire supervisory union, assuring mutual accountability along with the superintendent, and seeking greater student opportunity and operating efficiency. So both the local school board and the supervisory union have their roles to play, and it's critical if you're the chair of a supervisory union board, that you clearly establish what your role is, and keep in mind that not everyone in your community will understand the role of the supervisory union board, and as the chair you may find the need to even remind people or inform people of what your role in that work is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had wanted to use the term. I think part of the chair's effort here is to really call people to look beyond the boundaries of their own town. At the same time, it's not to dismiss that close affiliation with a school district or a town, but to really expand that circle of concern to really your closest neighbors in the supervisory union.
So this slide is going to walk us through our wheel. We think of it as the ongoing cycle of school board's essential work. And all of these elements are the major functions that are really central to the role of any board member, not just the chair. But the chair is responsible for the oversight of the essential work of the school board and ultimately are accountable for the quality of local education. It's just important as you go through your cycle to remember that the school board doesn't operate the school. It provides that strong oversight, and that you'll rely on the strong leadership of your superintendent and work with him or her in establishing guidance for the system. Boards are really not equipped to do all the minute operational work, and you'll find that you have difficulty working with a really experienced and dedicated superintendent. So it's best to just we think it's best to work with this cycle. We always recommend that you think of your work in these terms. First, we start with engaging the community to create a shared vision, and then employ a superintendent to lead the board and the community achieving that vision, and throughout establishing policy parameters where appropriate, and adopting a budget that supports the vision that you've established, and continually monitoring progress toward your vision, all while negotiating contracts that are aligned with student needs, vision, and community expectations. And that should really give any effective chair plenty to oversee throughout the year.
Yeah, it is a full plate. I'm really struck listening to you walk us through that cycle, how many times we refer to the vision as a component which defines these central tasks of the board. And I think that's a key sort of mindset for a board chair to keep in mind, that probably the vehicle that will both most effectively drive the work and hold the system accountable, and I think call people to the broader purposes of the school system, is to continually look at what is it that we want for all of our students. That idea of outcomes or vision, I mean, it's called a mission, but it's really the abiding purpose that this organization is intended to achieve.
Yeah, I think that an effective chair is able to really keep an eye to the big picture right here and always question whether the work that the board is undertaking is in line with really the essential work. So moving on to our second key role is to establish a strong connection with the administration to build common vision and a strong sense of teamwork. Important to remember that the board chair doesn't carry any more authority than anyone else on the board, but really has the responsibility for continually promoting effective operations. And that's really going to, in many instances, come down to a strong relationship with the superintendent. Strong collaboration and good communication are really important elements of working together as a team.
You know, I wanted to chime in here, Emily, because I think the working relationship between the board chair and the superintendent, as you've just described, is so central to the effectiveness of this organization. And I think it's a complex and delicate relationship to find a rhythm with. And I describe that by saying, you know, typically the superintendent is one of, if not the most experienced and skilled educators in the school system. And by contrast, you know, most of our board members are not professional educators.
Right.
I mean, they all bring, you know, both professional experience, life experience, and, you know, an understanding of this role and an effort to fulfill it. But mostly I'm trying to acknowledge the fact that it's not necessarily an instantly easy and comfortable dynamic that I've heard many board chairs say something like, you know, who am I to question the superintendent or, you know, expect things of him or her. And so I think it's getting comfortable with the idea that that is the role of the board and specifically the chair to take a lead in building those good relations with the superintendent, and I know you're going to go into some more specifics around that, but I just want to acknowledge that I don't think that it may well be in many instances, but I don't think in every instance it takes work to get there, and I think acknowledging the different starting points can be a helpful way to make progress.
Absolutely. So let's look at really the complexity that underlies these relationships. It's kind of structural. So this graphic shows that the board really is responsible, like we said earlier, for the vision and the policy and the accountability and the resources for this system. And then you have your superintendent, your systems leader, we say sometimes the CEO for the district, who is accountable to the supervisory union board as well as to member district boards. So there's some complexity inherent just in the role of the superintendent. Then you have your principals, who are the educational leaders for the schools, who are accountable to the superintendent. And this graphic attempts to illustrate that information and questions and guidance flow from the board to the superintendent and back and forth, and same for the superintendent and the principal, that these relationships are really important, and we shouldn't let the seemingly confusing hierarchical structure prevent high functioning. So, Harry, I feel like you have a lot to add here. You work in the system.
Yeah, no, I did want to chime in here. I didn't want to interrupt, but let me, now that I have, say, I often say to boards in the context of a training session, so this is illustrating sort of flow of information and working relationships. In many systems, there are conversations that are direct between the principal and the board. But what's critical here is that you've thought that through as a body. You've talked about when and where and how and why channels of communication or exchange of ideas should take place, and you've agreed that's how you're going to operate, and everybody abides by those practices. And I'm saying that to draw a contrast with, you know, if there are individual board members that decide they want to talk directly to the principal or a staff member and develop a channel of communication that's not something that's been talked about and agreed to, it can begin to erode the sort of confidence that the board members have in each other, that the board has in itself, and for that matter, but comfort and confidence between the administration and the board. So it's to underscore the importance of a free flow of information within an agreed upon framework and set of practices.
Yeah, and I think you used the word practice early on, and what immediately occurred to me was that you might need to practice the flow of information. This isn't necessarily going to be natural at first, but I think just an awareness and a thoughtfulness to these relationships can go a long way.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So particularly as the board chair, the chair's relationship with the superintendent is very important. You should really work closely with the superintendent to coordinate the work of the board with the administration, and seek out the superintendent for if you need advice on bringing matters before the board or dealing with issues, and you might use these principles in setting out your relationship with the superintendent. Goal setting with the superintendent and the goals that are in turn being set for the principals is a very important conversation for the board chair and the superintendent to have, as well as the board conducting regular performance reviews of the superintendent. The board chair and the superintendent should establish communication norms with one another and be very comfortable reaching out if there's a problem or a concern, and then identifying and resolving issues with the district board and addressing appropriate issues formally through the SU board. Ultimately, the supervisory union employs the superintendent, but that doesn't mean that many issues can be worked out at the district level. At all times, I would say encourage the superintendent to come to you as the chair with any problems. Keep confidences of the superintendent where appropriate, and be open about what information needs to be shared with the full board. And work with the board members and the superintendent, I'd say, to determine how you'll share different kinds of information and ensure that the rest of the board doesn't feel excluded as you strike the balance of a close working relationship with the superintendent.
Yeah, can I add in here as well, Emily, to underscore the importance of those last points? We frequently guide individual board members who might give us a call about a question they have to reach out to the board chair, and typically to the board chair and the superintendent, to share their question or idea or concern. And the structure really reinforces, I think, what you've just said, which is, the chair sits in the position of hopefully having the whole picture because he or she works closely with the superintendent and has close working relationships with individual board members. So information can be shared that way, in that the board chair can pay attention for when are there patterns that we need to attend to. And obviously that happens through the superintendent's perspective as well as the board chair's. But those kinds of agreements about how are we going to share this information, one-to-one and then with the full board, are all really important in building the confidence and trust across board members, between the board and the administration, and ultimately leading to doing your job well. So it's that establishing those practices and attending to patterns when they appear.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of that comes down to timing. When is something an issue that the superintendent needs to know about, or vice versa? When does the superintendent know to call up the board chair to address an issue? And I know just from my work with boards that one of the hallmarks of a strong system is when I get a call from someone with a problem and I say, oh, have you talked to your board chair or your superintendent about this? Oh, yeah. They know. We've discussed it. Now we're turning outside for advice. I really like to hear people say that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed.
So we're moving on to our next key role of the chair, which is very important, to organize and conduct productive meetings. Board meetings, as we know, are how the board takes action to accomplish its goal, and it's the chair's responsibility to ensure those meetings are productive, inclusive, and lawful. So here are some elements of productive meetings. That you have effective agendas, you follow Robert's Rules of Order, you observe open meeting and public records laws, that you effectively facilitate community conversations and continually strive for consensus. And these components are key to conducting those productive meetings. In addition to the information we have here, the VSBA has a lot of resources, and so especially when we get into things like Robert's Rules of Orders and the open meeting law and the public records laws, you can always reach out to the VSBA with any troubleshooting questions. So to build an effective agenda, first of all, you'll want to collaborate with your superintendent to build the agenda for the meeting and fall into a good pattern of deciding what needs to be on the board's agenda and timing the issues that come before the board, and to always align what's on your agenda with the board's goals. And so, like we said earlier with the essential work wheel, you as the chair should have your eye to the extent that you can on the big picture. And if something's going to be on the agenda, be mindful of whether it's getting you towards your mission and vision. The agenda should also include a manageable number of issues for each meeting so that each item can be given the necessary consideration and so that meetings are kept to a reasonable length out of respect to your fellow board members and the community members who attend, as well as your superintendent who attends. And limit action items on the agenda to those that the board has had time to consider previously so that everyone has the time to comment on those items and that the community feels like they have the time to really be involved in the board's decision where appropriate. And ensure clarity on your agenda so that the public is reasonably informed of what you're going to be discussing at your meetings. So those are just some things to keep in mind when you're setting agendas for meetings. Very important task.
Yeah, Emily, I want to underscore how, the agenda fundamentally provides a structure for everybody, and I think in so doing, it creates a sense of safety or security in that we know what we're attending to, we know what our task is. I know you've spoken in the past to, the different types of agenda items. Are we here to purely be informed about an item? Is this for our discussion, or are we to take action at this point? And the agenda can set all that up in a way that is reassuring. And I want to sort of add just one, what I think is a really important tangent to that. We do a lot to support those boards that have student representatives, and I think an agenda is one of the most effective tools for providing student representatives a good handle to hold on to in thinking about how do I participate in this meeting in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
I actually think it's probably equally true for adult board members, particularly as you're new to a board. But though that structure is an extraordinarily important device for both getting your work done and for engaging people in that work.
Absolutely. Another element that board chairs often wrestle with is Robert's Rules of Order, but have no fear. Robert's Rules, although it's I think we're up to 669 pages in the newly revised Robert's Rules, at least we say 80% of the the content of Robert's Rules of Order is only needed about 20% of the time. So it's really not too big of a task to master Robert's Rules, to practice Robert's Rules, and to gain confidence operating under Robert's Rules. And really most of the content of the rules are there because it's sometimes come up as a question of procedure somewhere. So, you know, all boards struggle with questions of procedure, and there's no reason to be intimidated. Typically, a question about Robert's Rules will come up when a contentious topic is before the board. And so the best advice we can give is to really brush up as a board chair on Robert's Rules anytime that you know something that's controversial or something that's going to be a cause for debate is going to be occurring at your upcoming meeting. If you get a question about the rules or a point of order, that you as a chair should feel absolutely comfortable to ask for some time to recess in order to consult the rules, to ask, you know, your superintendent to help clarify one of the rules. Often superintendents have a good deal of experience operating under Robert's Rules. The VSBA is a resource. You can contact me with Robert's Rules questions, and just like a board chair, I march over to the shelf and get out the tried and tested copy of Robert's Rules and, you know, struggle to find the answer. I know very few people who know the majority of Robert's Rules by heart. It's a matter of looking it up. Another thing I want to remind you of is that school boards can agree to operate by Robert's Rules for small boards, and that's a more simplified and less formal set of procedures that many boards find is comfortable to operate under. Another thing that we here at the VSBA help boards with a lot is the open meeting and public records laws. Essentially, school board meetings, and remember this includes meetings of subcommittees, must always be open to the public. The public has to be given notice and a reasonable opportunity to be heard at the meeting, and there are more detailed rules about the amount of notice depending on the type of meeting held. But the slide here provides the citations which is in our green book that the VSBA provides. They're in Title I of the Vermont statutes in the 300s. So it's always fun to look up the open meeting laws, but if you need help or it's not clear how to legally operate under the open meeting law, you should reach out to your superintendent or the VSBA or your school legal counsel with those questions. It's very important to be compliant.
Yeah, I just want to add a note on that. I think being very deliberate in upholding these laws is one of the central ways in which a board builds the trust of the community, and for that matter among the board, as a body as well. So I just wanted to reinforce that message.
And I think this is also a good place to remind board chairs and all school board members that board members should be using their school district email addresses to keep business communication separate. It's really best practice to have a dedicated email address and be very conscientious about using that email address for your school board business. All written communication emails among board members could potentially be subjected to an open records request, and so here's the caution to never put anything in writing that you would not want to see on the front page of the newspaper. I love to give that warning. So one of the nuances of the open meeting law is the executive session requirements, and board chairs should be keeping in mind that the rules for executive session, which are essentially that the board, if it has a topic that qualifies and needs to be discussed in executive session, that the board should first meet in public and then vote to close the meeting by a motion that indicates the nature of the business that the board will be discussing in executive session. You can find those permissible reasons for entering executive session in Section 313 of the Open Meeting Law, and there are some people, including your attorney, your administrative staff, and the people who might be the subject of the discussion in executive session who can come into that meeting, but the rest of the public will be excluded just for the portion of the meeting that qualifies for executive session. Very important to keep in mind that the board should not make any decision or take any action while in executive session. You need to come out back into public session to have a motion and a vote in open session.
So it's quite common that boards use the phrase or use the term personnel to make a motion to enter executive session. I want to underscore Emily's comments here. While personnel issues are certainly often considered in executive session, the motion to enter executive session really must use language that's directly from statute. And so what I would say is typically the topic is the phrase the employment or evaluation of an employee. And so I'm using that illustration to reinforce the message that it's critical for boards to follow the letter of the law and in fact use the language directly from the law specific to executive session to make that motion to enter the executive session and to follow the guidelines Emily just walked through.
Yeah, and these topics are not easy, and board chairs are most often lay people, and there's not an expectation that you have a detailed understanding of the open meeting law, and you should not hesitate to reach out for help. Often these questions are more sensitive than we even here at the VSBA can help you. And, we might even direct you to your legal counsel because it's sometimes complicated and it's sometimes hard to get it right, but you should definitely be conscientious at all times to make sure that your board is operating lawfully under the open meeting law. Another element of running effective meetings is to facilitate community conversations. This is sort of a well-loved adage that board meetings are public meetings, but they are not a meeting of the public. And what that really means is that the public can and should have a voice in board deliberation, but no person or group has the right to obstruct board deliberations. And the chair really plays the role of ensuring the public feels welcome at meetings while taking care that they stay focused on the agenda and that the meetings are productive. So we find that it's helpful for boards to adopt a policy or practice that allows community members an opportunity to speak within some established time restraints, often before board action is taken, and to really clearly communicate what those restraints are and be upfront so that the community knows the expectations for engaging in conversations with the board. These appearing on the slide are two provisions of law that outline the boundaries for community engagement. Of course, under the open meeting law, the public has the right to a reasonable opportunity to appear and express their views. But here in the second provision, the chair has the ability to establish reasonable rules to govern public comment, and the chair should definitely exercise the ability to lay out those reasonable rules.
There's a what I've witnessed on many boards is a practice where the board has an ongoing conversation with members of the community who attend, and I try to what I say to boards is this, that you are the members of the community that were elected or appointed to look out for every child and every taxpayer, and no one else that comes to the meeting has that same obligation. they're there to provide a perspective on whatever the question or idea might be. But ultimately, it's the board who's responsible to take that big picture perspective. And that's how I try to reinforce the importance of drawing those boundaries between the public participation in the meeting and the board's work, which is, to do all of the things that you've identified tonight in that cycle of essential work. And at the same time, I recognize it's not an easy line to draw. I'm looking at the images that are appearing on the screen now.
Which are offered all in good fun, of course. Yeah, often the people that come to board meetings are your friends and neighbors as the board chair, and sometimes there will be difficult conversations, and it's important, I think, to establish well understood ground rules for all board meetings, for non-contentious board meetings, so that if an issue does come up that draws a lot of debate, the community is comfortable with how the board expects for that input to be given, and how the board will really stay focused on the work before it.
Yeah, I mean, that's when it plays out in some of the more challenging ways. But even in a sort of ongoing fashion, drawing those lines is really important.
And I don't think that these pictures are of Vermonters. I would just like to say that. I think they're from another state.
Thanks for clarifying, Emily.
That's just my best guess. So another element of productive meetings is to strive for consensus among your board. And you as the chair can play a really strong role in striving for consensus. Consensus is when all members of the group are willing to accept a decision, even when it's not necessarily each individual's first choice. The group reaches consensus when all members consider the approach that they've agreed on workable and in the best interest of the group. It's really more about listening than talking and facilitating board discussion. So chairs can really help the whole board strive for consensus by at all times ensuring that differing viewpoints are being heard and explored, by encouraging the board to seek inquiry instead of argument, by looking out for points of similarity that emerge, and for allowing differences of opinion and recognizing good points on each side. You can urge people to focus on their interests and not so much their positions, and explore why different board members might be agreeing when you start to find those threads of agreement to seek alignment. And you might not get full agreement, but you might bring the differing sides closer to one another.
I think that practice of encouraging inquiry and, in fact, asking questions yourself as the board chair, asking questions of other board members, the superintendent, the presenters that might be at the meeting, I think that modeling that is a really effective mechanism for building consensus.
It's really an ideal, and it won't always be possible, but something to strive toward. So we're moving on to promoting lawful and ethical operation of the board, which is a really important role of the chair. The first way to do that is to observe these guidelines for lawful and ethical operations, which is several elements. Be clear, first of all, that you have no legal power outside of the school board. This is really important. Often when talking to community members outside of board meetings, there might be a perception that the school board chair wields some authority to really take action on an individual concern, and it's important to make it clear that the board takes action as the board, and really the chair can only work with the board. Second, to maintain confidentiality of executive session is something to keep in mind. Executive session topics, as we said before, are are often sensitive. Disclosure of those topics could potentially infringe upon individual privacy rights because of the nature of the topics that are reserved for executive session. So board trust often depends on the understanding that what is shared in executive session stays there. And I mention that because there's not a requirement in law that what's said in executive session stays there. So it's really the honor of individual school boards that you will keep those discussions there so that the board can operate effectively. We'll say again that you should assure that schools are well run, but strive to not run them, and to observe the difference between the work of the board and the work of the administration. To at all times avoid conflicts of interest or the perception of a conflict of interest, which we'll get into on the next two slides. And like we said on the consensus slide, to really recognize the validity of board decisions, even if you don't agree with the final outcome. And that ties into that you have only the power to act as a board. So once the board has decided, it's important for individual board members to get behind that decision and at least not work to tear down the decision after it's been made, whether or not you agree.
Emily, I wanted to add a couple of comments to reinforce your central points there. On the question of avoiding conflict of interest or the perception, it's almost impossible to avoid the perception of a conflict of interest in small towns because we know each other and often are engaged in economic relationships with each other. So I come back to that point to say it's critical for the board to really deal with those kinds of questions as transparently as possible, acknowledging that it's probably inevitable that there will be times when there are questions which decisions which may bear on benefits that board members may gain directly or indirectly, and identifying those and attending to them. We strongly encourage board members to recuse themselves from any discussion of a decision or a question that might bear on their what they might benefit from. So I just wanted to underscore that how important perception is here.
Yeah, we're really going to get into those considerations because it's definitely important and ongoing work of the board. So you can, as a board, choose to establish a code of ethics. We recommend it. These are the tenets of any good code of ethics, but each board can tailor what it will agree to itself. But really, it's important that all agree that you will act within the scope of your official role on the board, uphold high ethical standards, and respect peers, constituents, and confidentiality. And so just making sort of a promise to fellow board members can be really helpful in holding each other accountable to those promises. One important element of ethical operations is managing potential conflicts of interest. And as Harry said, these are always going to come up, especially in our small towns and communities. I've often heard it said that if you don't have a conflict of interest in Vermont, you're not working hard enough. I really love that saying. So acknowledging that these are going to come up and that is by no means the end of the world. It's just a conversation that the board needs to thoughtfully undertake and be comfortable having. So the law requires every school board to have a conflict of interest policy. The VSBA has a really good model conflict of interest policy that's very widely used. It lays out a really good process to work through a conflict of interest or a perceived conflict of interest and to handle outside complaints that might come from someone other than a board member that there's been a conflict of interest. It's the legal and ethical duty of all board members to avoid those conflicts, avoid the appearance, and to follow the procedure for disclosure of a conflict and the recusal. So when a board member becomes aware that he or she has a conflict, or it looks like he or she might have a conflict. The process is to declare it to your fellow board members when it comes up, to declare the nature and extent of the conflict, to have that included in the minutes. If it's decided that that's a legitimate cause for concern with a conflict of interest, that board member should abstain from voting or participating in the discussion of that issue that gives rise to the conflict. So it's just a really simple process of saying, hey, there's an issue here. I'm disclosing what it is. I'm going to refrain from participating in that part of the meeting, and then you've really addressed the problem. That's the responsible way to handle it.
So first question is, can boards use consensus to decide a matter rather than a vote under Robert's rules?
So I'm going to refer to Robert's Rules for Small Boards. There is a process that the Rules for Small Boards allows that you don't have to take a vote on every issue. It's important to refer to the rules themselves, as we said on the Robert's Rules slide, to make sure that you're following the process, and I certainly don't have it memorized, but yes, there is the ability for a small board that has agreed to operate under Robert's Rules for Small Boards to operate more informally and to, in certain instances, operate by consensus, yes.
Great. So second question, do board chairs draft the agenda and then distribute to the superintendent? And a couple related questions, all from the same writer. How much involvement does the principal have in drafting agendas? So that's the combination of questions.
Yeah, I think it's important for the board chair to have an idea of what the agenda should look like and to check with the superintendent to see if their ideas for the agenda are in line, or if there's a concern that the superintendent has something that should be added to the agenda. And certainly agenda items might come from a principal, something that maybe the principal and the superintendent have discussed as needing board action. They can definitely originate with the principal.
Okay, and it looks like we have one more question at this point. Is there a specific book about Robert's Rules for small boards that we should buy or would be a good resource?
Yes, so there are many publications of Robert's Rules and Robert's Rules for small boards. I most often use an internet search. That information is widely available online, and also we can connect you with it here at the VSBA. I don't use a particular copy of Robert's Rules. Sometimes whatever is at hand is the best resource, because anyone who publishes Robert's Rules is consistent with the content of the rules, and for small boards as well.
So Emily, that's what we have for questions at this point. I'll turn it back to you if you'd like to close out.
Yeah, I want to close out by encouraging and asking very nicely for everyone to follow the link that appears on this last slide. We promise that it is a very short evaluation. It's going to take you to SurveyMonkey, and it should take less than 5 minutes to complete, and it's really a huge help to us here in the office to always continually improve the services that we offer to board members. You'll also find my contact information on this last slide. Email is a great way to get in touch with me, but our phone number also appears here, and feel free to reach out if any questions come to mind after we've closed out the webinar. And I want to thank everybody for attending, and thank you for your questions, and wish you good luck in your work as a school board chair and a good year.